So I'll start again by, thanking everyone for taking the time out of their day to join us here. And welcome to the Dataverse community meeting session on geospatial data. My name is Kevin Worthington, and I will be co-chairing the session with Jim Myers. You've probably all seen this screen, but if you haven't, just try to keep your mic off, raise your hand if you have a question. While you're talking, it'd be nice to turn your camera on in addition to your mic to increase engagement with others. Notes will be taken during this session using a shared Google Doc, which you're invited to contribute to. So leave the chat, for questions or other shared information. And as you've been alerted, this meeting is being recorded and will be available in the future for others to access. So yeah, we do have quite a great agenda here. I'll start by giving a brief introduction to the session topic and share my related work, after which we'll hear from others working in this area. We'll then open the floor for discussion in hopes of collectively developing priorities for next steps in better supporting geospatial data within Dataverse. And the session will conclude at 6:10 Eastern Time with a wrap up. So just so we're all on the same page when we're talking about geospatial data, this is data with a sense of place on Earth. So typically this data has latitude and longitude, or Y and an X coordinate, but other grounding information is possible, like a postal code, zip code, census tract, etc. This, however, will eventually be converted to some latitude and longitude, which are really dependent on a defined coordinate system. Not to get too into the weeds, but a coordinate system is comprised of three parts: projection, scale, and a datum, making for many coordinate reference systems. But luckily, with web maps, they generally use a common coordinate reference system, that's EPSG 4326, and that really simplifies things a lot. You can use basically any web map and it will support that. There are two main types of geospatial data: raster and vector. You could think of raster data as a gridded surface where data is stored in cells and can include color bands to separate the information. And then for vector data, uses XY coordinates, and there are three feature types of vector, which are point, line, and polygons. With vector data, each feature can contain many attributes, making it more versatile than raster data. And just to conclude on this, there are many benefits to sharing geospatial data online. Really, you can reach a much broader audience, which helps facilitate multidisciplinary research. You can view data in context, like being able to overlay it on a base map. You can also assess the suitability of the underlying tabular data by exposing its attributes and values. And to help put this landscape into perspective, let's briefly look at some of the elements to consider when sharing geospatial data online. So the first of which is there are many different geospatial file formats available. This was taken from QGIS, an open source geospatial software, and yeah, it's quite overwhelming. Right now, Dataverse has special handling for shape and tabular files, but is it worth considering more of these? Perhaps hierarchical data formats, which are used heavily for scientific data storage like HDF and NetCDF. Also, what geospatial web services to employ? These allow for the efficient visualization of geospatial data online. This isn't nearly as daunting a question as which file formats to support, but it does really depend on the different data types that you're working with, whether it be vector, raster, or both. And lastly, what geospatial metadata should be supported? There are many flavors with different strengths. The ability to support feature attribute information or field level metadata is often overlooked, which really does limit the reusability of this data. Legacy FGDC standards, ISO 19110, and ArcGIS JavaScript API, as shown by this form on the right, do offer this field level metadata capability. And it almost seems as if geospatial data curation needs its own tool within Dataverse to help support this sort of more granular metadata. So let's now talk a little bit about where we were. So not long ago, geospatial data uploaded to Harvard's Dataverse had the ability to be published out to world map for geospatial search, discovery, and visualization. This workflow used the GeoConnect module, enabling the communication between the two platforms. Unfortunately, this workflow was unsustainable. And as of Dataverse version 5.4, this is no longer available. At present, there are other solutions in the wild leveraging different web-based geospatial discovery systems. On the one hand, using Dataverse's harvest system has allowed records from open GeoPortal to be discovered within Dataverse. And as an alternative, data that exists in Dataverse has been harvested by middleware and ingested into GeoBlacklight, which we'll talk more about later. So where are we going? This is really to be determined, and hopefully today's discussion will help prioritize next steps. Some ideas that have been tabled are the inclusion of geospatial search within Dataverse. This could be facilitated by having an easier way to define a boundary box for data files and may include an embedded map on appropriate file landing pages. Perhaps the development of geospatial data previewer could help with visualizing data within Dataverse. And of course, this opens up the need to generate geospatial web services, just like what World Map afforded. These are but a few potential features. And during this discussion, I encourage you to share your use cases so they might be considered as well. And with that, we will begin with the presentations. So I will begin. And again, hello, my name is Kevin Worthington, and my role at Colorado State University as the Geospatial Data Manager is to work with campus and local community members in establishing a unified system for managing, storing, indexing, and sharing archival geospatial data to further multidisciplinary research. And to that end, I've been getting a lay of the land by assessing the geospatial data we have on hand. There's a lot of geospatial data in and around CSU, but these data currently exist in disparate systems, and many do not support geospatial data discovery or exploration beyond standard search. Looking to develop a harmonized collection had me investigating the options in use and no longer in use. There exists many migrations from one platform to another, which is quite telling. GeoBlacklight and ArcGIS Hub seem to be where people are landing. Because I think it's important to stay open source, GeoBlacklight, is the clear winner. Except, I've participated in a similar exercise roughly 5 years ago while working at Scholars Portal. And at that time, it was determined that researchers had come to expect from Scholars GeoPortal that there were so many features that they would be losing if we were to migrate to another system. And even today, these features remain absent. So I've taken a hybrid approach to address these omissions by sandwiching an extended GeoBlacklight schema between a curation tool and an enhanced front-end system. This extended schema offers support for datasets, keeping group layers together, attribute details, which could be used as part of the search, and style information to maintain the original appearance of the data. The front end is really a streamlined Scholars GeoPortal, but built with open source libraries. It's able to tap into geospatial services and offer enhanced features like multi-layer map viewing, layer styling, subsetting, and a split view. On the whole, the complete system looks like this. We have Python scripts, which allow for scheduling or manual harvest from defined endpoints. Then these data sets are able to be curated and ingested into the Solr search engine, at which time they can be accessed from the front end for discovery and exploration. External geospatial web services are utilized by the system for visualizing. And ultimately, the plan is to implement an institutional repository that would provide geospatial web services as part of this offering. Under the hood, the Geospatial Manager uses Django, which offers flexible curation. There's a ton of default functionality that I won't go into. Layers can be edited as needed and then ingested into Solr. really is a best of both worlds interface in that different researchers accessing the system can be supported. For those looking for a particular data set, landing pages offering search engine optimization enables direct Google access. From within the system, data can be found by either browsing facets, word searches, and by map bounds. The left bar is where facet search results and details are revealed. In this example, I'm demonstrating how data sets with sublayers are grouped together for exploration and able to be accessed to reveal their details. Data of interest can be added to the map along with other data layers. And the web interface offers a slew of features for exploration of these data in context with each other. I'd like to thank those from the community who took the time to discuss this project with me during the planning process. Also, a special thanks to Kara and Sean, who acted like a small steering committee to keep me on track. And on the right are all the folks from Fort Collins, both at CSU and locally, who have been a tremendous support for me and this project. There are a number of next steps. Most relevant to this session is the potential to develop a geospatial previewer for Dataverse, should there be geospatial web services available. This wouldn't be too difficult given the tooling already available in this project. It would simply require a trimmed down code base. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I will now pass it on to Wim Hgl from DANS. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. All good?
Yep, thanks, Wim.
Okay, so thanks, Kevin. I think that was a good overview. I'm going to broaden the discussion slightly because over the past 5 years or so, the definition and scope of geo-referenced data, spatially referenced data, has become very large and fuzzy, and now covers many more types of data. There's also a lot of diversity in the relationships that you find between metadata and data in this environment, in the earth and environmental sciences. And of course, all of these diversities and complexities have implications for software such as Dataverse. So maybe first let's look at the complexity. Increasingly now, if we want to generalize geospatially referenced data, we have to consider that we're talking about a voxel, essentially a pixel in 3 dimensions, or a location on the Earth, somewhere in the Earth's many spheres. That has 3 dimensions. There's a time dimension attached to it, which traditionally in geospatial data was not very well accommodated. In fact, a decade ago, if you had different sets of data for the same features for different times, you were basically forced to duplicate the entire data set for 2 different time slots. And then at the bottom, we have a combination of vocabularies that sort of adds to the dimensionality of the data. So these might be taxonomy, for argument's sake, when it comes to describing biodiversity and species data. And increasingly, the Earth and environmental observation community is working towards sets of essential variables, as they call. So in the biodiversity community, there's about 30 of these variables. For climate modeling, there's in the order of something like 40. The ocean observation and modeling community has got their own set, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look at specific examples, then biodiversity data typically has references in X and Y, and vocabulary that describes the taxonomy, and it may include additional data in respect of time of observation and the additional environmental variables associated with that, or essential variables associated with that taxonomy. So these might be things like the life stage of the species that was observed, for example. Traditional maps, Kevin has discussed, so they are generally speaking just in 2 dimensions, flat maps, X and Y. They generally don't have a time dimension, and they more or less represent any variable out in the wild. Sensor data is a little bit better defined in terms of the variables that they cover. They are mostly sparse in space, so there's only a few dots and spots on the globe where these sensors are deployed, but they are near continuous or almost continuous in time. And that makes it slightly different, for argument's sake, from traditional maps. And then the climate models would be an example of data that contains information across almost all of these dimensions. And there are transformations, standard procedures, schema mediators that translate the data between these different sort of traditional representations. So that gives us a wide scope of complexity for the types of data that we might encounter. But there's also an additional problem, and that is mutability, because when it comes to sensor data, for instance, or remotely sensed data from satellites and so on, they're continuously being added to. So the data set is not finite. It doesn't have bounds. Every day or every second or every millisecond, there are data records being added to the data set. So it doesn't have a fixed definition. You can't go and put a boundary around it. And this, of course, from a metadata and data persistent identification point of view is a huge issue. Okay, so the next slide summarizes a whole bunch of generic cases in terms of the relationships between metadata and data. So we have this very peculiar situation, for instance, for biodiversity data that's stored using a Darwin core schema, where the metadata for species observations and the data is exactly the same. So they're basically using the metadata for an observation as the data itself. We have the very common situation with multidimensional data sets such as NetCDF, HDF, and so on, that Kevin has also touched on, where a lot of the metadata is actually part of the data set. It's present in the headers of the individual data files that make up a data collection. And then the third one is more like the stuff that we used to, where there is a separate metadata record pointing to a very distinct data set or collection of files or some digital object that we want to describe using that data set. Then we have the situation where we have continuously changing digital objects such as sensor data. So we have metadata records, but we have to artificially map them to sections of this continuously changing data set, because otherwise we don't have anything to cite or to reference or to find, for that matter. And often the choice to about the granularity of the metadata is entirely driven just by discovery considerations. In other words, providing enough detail and enough numbers in the metadata records so that if people search within time periods or across space or a combination of both, they find more or less the data that they're interested in and don't get referred back to just one enormous data set all the time. Then there are also cases where the metadata does not describe a digital object, but some other artifact. I don't think that's so important yet in the Dataverse community. We also have a situation in Dataverse quite often where the metadata describes a collection of different objects, but there are other variations on this theme. For instance, in the ISO 19115 metadata standard, there are specific vocabularies to describe the roles of the different files that are included in that metadata data package. So some of it might be supplementary information, some of it might be the data set itself, some of it might be a different representation of the same data set, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then we have the worst possible case at the bottom, where we have these very large multidimensional data sets that are subsetted on the fly as people query them. In other words, a researcher might want a chunk out of a climate model that only applies to whatever, Connecticut for the next 10 years, and they are going to cite only that data. So metadata is generally created on the fly from a template for the entire data set for that download or subsetting exercise, as well as a persistent identifier. And that leads us to all kinds of issues when it comes to reproducibility concerns in science. So if
Wim,
we
you have
then,
about 1 minute.
yeah, cool. So if I skip then to the implications that we might find for Dataverse, ring fencing collections based on curation and preservation practices will be necessary, because not all of these data sets are going to reside in the Dataverse environment under the control of the curators. And for things like certification with Core Seal, you must be in a position to explicitly indicate which of the data sets that you are referring to is up for certification. It cannot be data sets for which you don't control the physical hardware or the environment. We've already talked about the fact that the PID associated with a physically distinct object cannot extend to all the use cases, and the subsetting and extraction is complex because there is a different way of doing this, a different syntax and a different vocabulary for almost each of the different data standards that we work with. And then I think the biggest one for me is second from the bottom, where citation and reproducibility is complex. The recommendations from the RDA require us to cache or to store these subsets, because that's the only way in which they can be retrieved with certainty with the same checksum as whatever has been cited by the researcher. So those are my thoughts. I have some ideas about implementation in Dataverse, but I think that will come out in the discussion. Thank you.
I think we're up next.
Yep, go for it.
All right, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark McGee. I'm here with my colleague, Maura Carbone, to talk a little bit about Harvard's explorations into Dataverse and Geo Blacklight integration. I would say we're probably coming at it from a kind of a broader level. But first thing we wanted to do was talk a little bit about what is HGL. So HGL is currently the Harvard Geospatial Library, or HGL, is at its core a collection of 11,000 plus Harvard Library owned and licensed geospatially enabled map data layers. Geospatial data sets can be searched, previewed in geographic context, and then downloaded for use with GIS software. So it's basically a search and discovery system. And the screenshot that you're looking at is the beta of our relaunch using Geo Blacklight as our front end. We're coming from OpenGeo portal at this point. Geo Blacklight is a collaborative open source geospatial data search, discovery, and delivery platform that's built in partnership with a growing list of academic and nonprofit organization partners led by Stanford, Princeton, NYU, the Big Ten Academic Alliance, MIT, University of Minnesota. Geo Blacklight leverages the existing data and metadata from HGL and other spatial data repositories and provides a collaboratively built interface to search both the data and metadata across institutions. And with this HGL relaunch, we'll be uploading new content, uploading partner institutional records, and providing a much cleaner experience for our users. will also be part of the Geo Blacklight community, which is strong and which we're really looking forward to being closer partners with. Dataverse and HGL goals. One of the goals of our migration project to Geo Blacklight was to develop a framework for including non-library Harvard-based repositories into the HGL collection. And we really wanted to think more broadly about data curation for the collection and expand access to Harvard's digital geospatial assets across the university, not just library holdings. And the Harvard Dataverse, which is already very rich and growing with geospatial content, is a natural fit with HGL and was identified as an ideal first test case for us to pursue broader geospatial data integration. And we're looking here at an example of a Dataverse dataset, which includes shape files, related data, codebook files. One of the first and primary questions we needed to answer for Dataverse integration was how and where we would host the Dataverse geospatial data objects. And my colleague Maura is here and is going to take you through some of the options that we've explored thus far.
All right. So, hi, I'm Maura. So when we were initially starting this project off, one of the things we looked at, my coworker Jesse was investigating, was Geodesy. So she looked at this, and we initially had thought that Geodesy was sort of a plugin. When we were coming at it, we didn't really know much about it, and both Jesse and I were new to the team and new to geospatial world. And so one of the things we were exploring was if Geodesy is something you would just sort of plug into your rest of your geo stack, since we are doing GeoServer and Geo Blacklight. But we learned through exploring it that it isn't so much a piece to plug in as sort of an end-to-end. So we initially were playing around with seeing if we could take out the pieces that we needed, but it would have been a significant amount of work, combined with the fact that the strongest Java person was no longer going to be on the project, and I will freely admit that my having to do Java has been a little while, had made it sort of our not top choice, especially when we ended up finding out that there was a potential Ruby solution that we wanted to look into. Full disclosure, my Ruby's a lot better than my Java. So while we were looking into Geodesy, we had been working with Danny and a few others with Harvard Dataverse to sort of talk to them about what we were learning about Geodesy and things that we thought may or may not work for us. They informed us that, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, is it Libis? That's how I've been saying it. So if that is incorrect and you are the person who works there and that is wrong, I am sorry. But they had created this sort of Dataverse API gem. And as I said, you know, obviously we're working with Geo Blacklight. We use other, as someone had once called them to me, starlight items of the light family. And so we are definitely familiar with Ruby and Ruby on Rails. So we actually ended up starting to look at this as a pathway for getting Dataverse geospatial data into our new HGL stack. So the original plan had been to have the Dataverse team create an OAI PMH feed that would meet a certain criteria that we gave to them. In this case, obviously geospatial, things that were public and produced by Harvard affiliated authors, and also things that, in addition to being geospatial, actually had geospatial files we could use, either shape files or geotiffs. We then used this gem to use the API to harvest what we wanted based on that OAI PMH set from GeoServer, which would include downloading the metadata and the files, uploading those files into our GeoServer, and then transforming the appropriate metadata into JSON that we could index into our Geo Blacklight. And we actually did start doing this. The Dataverse team kindly started making us the OAI PMH set, and I had been testing stuff with the gem. And so this was our initial solution that we were going to attempt when the Dataverse team actually approached us about another potential pathway. So let me just go to my little notes. So while we were working on this and sort of chatting with Danny and folks about, you know, this is what we found, they were sending us the OAI PMH to take a look at. They actually informed us that, given, which you all are aware of, given that you're at this interest group meeting, there is a lot of interest in the Dataverse community and better serving geospatial data to users. And one of the things that they were interested in that they will talk more about, so I'm not going to get super into it, but is possibly having GeoServer as an add-on essentially to a base Dataverse, since this would allow them to index the files themselves and even within Dataverse possibly serve those geospatial files in a nicer way. So they saw it as a great way to enhance Dataverse. We saw it as awesome, because if you guys are just making the files, we could just harvest them similar to how we do with OpenGeo portal members. But it also had an added bonus of not having to worry about things getting out of sync. Obviously, if we're harvesting from Dataverse and we're pulling it into our Geo server based on the information we have at the time, the records can get out of sync. Maybe when we pull it, it was public, and then 3 months later it gets changed to restricted, but we still have it ingested as public. Who's monitoring that? Who's telling us? What do we do when stuff gets updated? So if we're just pulling records, it's similar to how we do things with OpenGeo portal, where we harvest your stuff every so often. You kind of have still control of the files. So if things like permissions change, you can lock those down immediately and, not have us serving it for 3 months. And then you're like, what are you doing? So that seemed like sort of a win-win to us. And so now I've sort of transitioned to less of, I'm going to try and build something, and more of a happy to help you with the fun that is GeoServer. And so I believe that is on the docket to be discussed a little bit more today. So I don't have a ton of detail on it, but that is sort of where we are at right now. But I will turn it over to Mark for an interim solution while we're still exploring that.
Yeah. So one thing that we thought about while we're waiting for kind of this broader full spatial data level integration, which would be the ideal end goal, was the possibility of a Dataverse metadata-only integration, whereby the Dataverse team has identified 4,000 plus Dataverse geospatial data sets through the OAI PMH interface. Could we then just ingest those metadata records and make them spatially searchable even without the geospatial data interface? Backend working.
Mark, it's about a minute.
Okay. This is an example of a Dataverse metadata record for a data set and related files that have been converted into the GeoBlacklight version 1.0 schema. And I just manually created this record and added it to our dev system just to get a sense of how the data might be modeled in GeoBlacklight. In the middle, we have the data set level description, which includes many direct metadata mappings for properties like title, author, description, those sorts of things. And in the callout window on the right-hand side, you can see under tools and related links on this page, there are links for each of the files associated with the data sets. And these link directly to the Dataverse file record for each item. And in the callout below, under derived data sets, you'll see bicycle collisions.zip, which is, it links to a GeoBlacklight child record just for the geospatial files from this data set. In this case, by collisions shape files. I think there's a lot of decisions that go into metadata conversion, how best to represent that data set file relationship. I'm not going to go into details now, but I have a lot of questions about that. And as well as how do we get coordinates out of some of these data sets? We can, in some cases, they're explicitly encoded. In some cases, it's a place name that could be converted from a gazetteer. In some cases, we could use GDAL libraries to read the spatial file to generate those bounding boxes that we would need for GeoBlacklight. Just wanted to raise that as a possible metadata-only conversion as a discussion point for the community. We think there's still value even without geospatial data being served and through WMS, and that those references could be added later on once those services are running. And with that, we just had questions and thoughts, but I think probably we're moving on to the UCLA group at this point.
Yep. Thank you, Mark and Maura. Go ahead, Jamie.
Okay, I guess, Christian, you're driving? Yes. Okay. I'm here from UCLA, and we're going to be talking about, we're really at the beginning of our project, integrating Dataverse and geospatial applications. So next one. Okay, and I want to introduce my colleagues. Now, I'm Jamie Jameson. I'm the collection manager for UCLA Dataverse. I'm here with Christian Allen, who is a software developer for the UCLA library, and Jiwan Yao, who is who's our spatial data science librarian at UCLA. So we're all going to talk about different sections. Okay. So we're going to just talk a little bit about geospatial data in Dataverse. How do I get that in there if I'm putting in a collection, and also evaluating discovery platforms, and then the Shoreline project at UCLA. So I want to make sure I give them enough time. My part in this is I selected some studies that had appropriate, had appropriate geospatial information and files. And we were going to limit this, or for the testing, we're limiting this to shapefiles. Now, Dataverse documentation really only recognizes shapefiles, although we do have other packages sometimes in Dataverse, and we have raster data such as LiDAR, but we're focusing in on the Esri style shapefiles. And now, if you haven't ever put this in here, this is what your editing view and the public view looks like for editing geospatial metadata. In your best possible world, this comes in with the collection, but if not, you're going to have the important one down here is your geographic bounding box that gives your north, south, east, and west boundaries of this spatial data. And as I said, that's best possible world to get that from the depositor. And if you don't, that's the next slide. How do we get that in? Oops. Oh, how do we get that information? Now, if you, oops, sorry, here we go. If it doesn't come with the data set, the easiest way is just to load your spatial data file into QGIS, ArcGIS, and then you get your bounding box. If you don't have that software, the other option is Python libraries exist for specific types of shapefiles, geo packages, and all that. And I've even tried some of those out. So that's how I put together the test files and different ways I would have gotten to describe them. So now I'm going to get to the more meaty part of the presentation. we're going to switch to Christian Allen.
Thanks, Jamie. So Jamie had mentioned the types of geospatial data that we're working with, and she had mentioned we're just starting off. So I think some of our data sets aren't as complex as some of the others discussed here, but hopefully you can leverage some of what we've learned. And so once this data is in Dataverse, the next step for us is, okay, we need some sort of discovery platform for this. I had these bullet points actually backwards. So we spoke with a few people, and we derived inspiration from some of the community-based projects. So in particular, the Geocity project is amazing. I'm really looking forward to Paul's talk. And we also spoke with the NYU team, which has a similar workflow to us, where essentially they have a repository and then they have a Geo Blacklight instance. And somehow this information needs to be not only extracted from Dataverse, but kept in sync with this. We also have the advantage that we have several other UCs that are looking at similar solutions in this space. And we have a UC-wide project going on right now that has a series of different sub-projects in it, and it's called Surfliner and Shoreline, which is essentially a branded version of Samvera, which is a digital library software that uses Blacklight as its front end. And Shoreline is a UC implementation of Geo Blacklight. We also use several of the other light family products. So we use Spotlight, standard Blacklight, as I mentioned. So we were already familiar with this and this software, and it's also a huge advantage to leverage some of the UC's existing knowledge. So this was sort of the reasoning behind some of the decisions we made going forward. So we decided to extend the geospatial subproject Shoreline, and Jiwan will go more in detail what Shoreline is and some of the core pieces we're working with. there were some extensive changes that we wanted to implement. UC Santa Barbara did a lot of the initial heavy lifting for getting content into Geo Blacklight. This seems to be a challenge for everyone, and they had a series of scripts that we could, and metadata transformations that we had looked at initially, and hope to leverage this into our solution. We're coming at it from a different angle, in that we already had a repository. The other, in particular, UC Santa Barbara didn't have a geospatial repository at this time, so they were doing a lot of the ingest piecemeal. And we were also interested in not using proprietary libraries. So the existing loading scripts were heavily leveraging ArcGIS and some ArcPy libraries that would cause some issues if we wanted to reproduce this or make test instances and things of that nature. Ideally, we'd want to containerize this and be able to distribute this to whether we want to deploy it in the cloud or locally. That really shouldn't matter. We also wanted to integrate heavily with the API of Dataverse. So currently there's some human intervention, and we really wanted to eliminate that. So ideally in our workflow, there should be no manual editing or tweaking of spreadsheets that are being exchanged between Dataverse and Geo Blacklight. And so we're making heavy use of the Dataverse API to extract metadata, and also using it for listening to know when new material gets added. And as others have mentioned, we're very interested in using open source geospatial tools. So we've heavily used Geo Blacklight, GeoPandas, PyShape, a variety of other Python modules, and some XSLT transforms to change between some of the metadata formats that they're already mentioned. So we also have a variety of different metadata formats, and it's helpful to have a common method for transforming this that performs reliably and is reproducible. And we're also making heavy use of the GDAL and OGR executables in place of some of the Esri software that was previously being used. And Jiwan will go more in detail about the Shoreline project and how we're working with the metadata coming out of Dataverse.
Thank you, Christian. So I'm going to talk about the Shoreline project at UCLA. So Shoreline project, or we call it Shoreline project, is a geospatial component of Surfliner project, and it was initiated by UCSB and UCSD. And Shoreline incorporates Geo Blacklight and GeoServer to provide a geospatial discovery platform for people to access geospatial data. And we joined the group, UCSD and UCSB last summer. And we joined the group, but we also want to customize our own instance at our local campus. So there's a big difference between UCLA and the other campuses is we incorporate Dataverse while the others don't incorporate Dataverse.
Jiwan, we have about a minute.
Sure, go ahead. And this gives a, so the top right image gives a simple description about the workflow that we have at UCLA. So basically it has 3 parts. So the first part is about we harvest data from Dataverse, and after harvesting and preparation, and we will ingest the data and also the metadata to GeoServer. The last part is we're going to ingest the metadata, which is in GeoJSON format, and to Geo Blacklight. And when we do the when we move forward and we identify some problems, and we try to find some solutions to solve the problem. So the top left is image about the metadata tools provided by our group, provided by UCSB and UCSD folks. So they provided valuable knowledge and input to extract the metadata and convert it to the GeoJSON format to be ingested to GeoBlacklight. But we found that these tools are heavily dependent on ArcPy, and also the ArcPy is written in Python 2. So we want to convert this process to be independent of ArcPy. And so yes, so last image gives a test website of the GeoBlacklight or instance at UCLA. And we haven't ingested any data yet, but we are working on preparing the metadata. So this is what we are now.
So thank you. Paul, do you want to go ahead and jump in?
Okay. So my name is Paul Dante. I'm based at University of British Columbia, and I am the primary software developer on the Geodesy project. So Maura, you can blame me for it being in Java. So Geodesy was created, the Canadian federal government wanted a better way for researchers to find Canadian research data, and they wanted an open source project for that. And so Geodesy was created to serve that need. It's driven by a map. It's driven by, we use GeoBlacklight, which we've seen a number of times before. And for phase one of the project, which ended in March 2020, we were very strongly coupled to Dataverse in that we were pulling metadata and data directly from the Scholars Portal Dataverse. Since then, in phase two, we've changed up our metadata source a little bit, but I'll talk about that later in the talk. So one thing that makes Geodesy a bit unique in terms of geospatial search is that we aren't just looking at geospatial files, like data sets with geospatial files. We're also looking at any sort of record that has a location component associated with it. So we're looking at if they're in the metadata, there are bounding boxes, or if there are place names in the metadata. As I said, it's an open source project, so all of our components are open source components, and all of the data is freely available on our GitHub. So as many of you know, searching for geospatial data can be complicated because it doesn't always fit nicely in a single named location. And so an example I have is when I was doing my master's, I was studying salmon habitat modeling in the Encampment River. So if I want to do a search for that, I would start off looking at Wyoming or WY or WY. I only want to do northern Wyoming, but it could also be southern Wyoming, could also be northern Colorado or the Edison National Forest or the Encampment River Wild, and so on and so forth. It becomes a really ugly looking text search. And so with the Geodesy interface, the map is sort of the driving force of where the search is looking. And it's looking for any data set that at least part of its bounding box is incorporated into what the view is currently. So we do use 4 main open source components. The first one, Dataverse, which is why I'm talking here today, because we did start off using Scholars Portal as sort of the main interface. And we're still using a Dataverse JSON style record to move the data from where it's stored, or the metadata from where it's stored, to our pipeline. We're using GDAL for extracting bounding boxes from geospatial files and for normalizing the files. So we're actually, in our pipeline, we're converting all rasters to geotiffs and all vectors to shapefiles, just to make it easier to put everything into GeoServer and preview it on GeoBlacklight, which is the next step, which is GeoServer, which we're using for dataset preview. And then GeoBlacklight is our discovery layer. We've made a minorly customized version of it to fit our needs. So sort of here's a quick summary of the pipeline. We pull in metadata and, if they're available, geospatial files. Try to get bounding boxes either through generating through GDAL or through processing the metadata. The geospatial files are then converted to one of those 2 formats I just said and put into GeoServer. We then crosswalk the metadata into two different forms. One is ISO 19115, and the other is Geo Blacklight JSON for Geo Blacklight. We are also actually pushing both those metadata files to open Geo metadata, so they're available for anyone else to grab those files if they want. And then Geo Blacklight harvest or indexes the Geo Blacklight JSON files that we've created. This is sort of a look at our actual structure. We've broken it up into a couple different VMs, in part for security reasons, so that people are really only interacting with the front end VM for Geo Blacklight, whereas the middleware is an independent VM, which allows for better separation of services for security reasons. So as has been mentioned before, Geo Blacklight requires bounding boxes for discovery. And so with our pipeline, if we can't get a bounding box for a specific data set, then that data set can't be searched via the Geodesy system. And as a result, it does mean that with our new system, there will be fewer records than if you did a text-based search not using Geodesy, given the same source material, because some of the things can't be found via geospatial locations. So as I said, part of what makes Geodesy unique is the fact that we are pulling geospatial location information from the metadata. So obviously, if there's a geographic bounding box entered, that's real easy. They've already created the bounding box for us. We can throw that in. The more complicated is the geographic coverage bounding boxes. We are using geo names to generate bounding boxes. This is one place where we do have some manual assistance on that. We decided that we needed certain things in order to make us feel comfortable to manually create or automatically create a bounding box. So it has to have a country. If it has a state, it needs to have the state and country, and if city, it needs to have state, country, and city all together. If any of those are missing, so if you have a city but no state, then it flags it for us, and then we have someone look at it to make sure it's not something obvious that we can adjust. And then if there's anything other, we flag it because other could be anything, and we don't trust geonames to generate a real bounding box with whatever is in there. So as I said, we are taking a Dataverse JSON and we're crosswalking into ISO 19115 and Geo Blacklight schema, while also adding a little bit of metadata that we're generating, such as time of when we generated and a few other things. So the thing that we've learned while working on this, a number of things. One of the big things we've learned is that when you're taking existing software and you're using it in a way that is not how it was originally intended, it can be more complicated than you would like. So it definitely took some work to get our pipeline up, just because we were sort of expanding on what was the existing functionality. Documentation has been super helpful, but I think one of the biggest things that has helped me as a software developer for this project is the communities of both Dataverse and Geo Blacklight. I've gotten so much help from both of those communities in getting this project working. In addition, because we're using so many different components, there are 5 different languages that I'm coding in, including then also like setting up infrastructure. And I am not an expert at all of these languages plus infrastructure setup. So having additional sort of peripheral people who can help out with those components has been really helpful as well. And then we did have to change our components a couple times, just because it turned out that things we had originally thought would work didn't work. And so it was good to have extra time in our plan for that. I did mention that phase 1 was tightly coupled with Dataverse. Phase 2, which we are currently in, which started in March 2022. We are working on a more focused implementation of Geodesy specifically for FERDR, the Federated Research Data Repository, which is trying to be a search portal for all Canadian research data.
All about a minute.
Okay, that is fine. So part of that was we shifted from pulling information metadata directly from Scholar's portal to pulling it from FERDR's Harvester database. FERDR does harvest Scholar's portal, but it harvests from more than 70 repositories, some of which are Dataverse style, some of which are not. In the interest of not having to completely rewrite the code that deals with the Dataverse JSON, we are exporting a Dataverse style JSON from the Harvester. So we're continuing to do the same processing of files. One thing that's also nice in terms of the open software for this is that we have created a French localization for Geo Blacklight, which did not exist before. We haven't pushed it out yet to the larger community, but it will be pushed out in the near future. That's about it. This is sort of the core team that we worked with. Started off with mostly UBC people, but now we also have some University of Saskatchewan and NGO employees who are working on it, and then a bunch of other project partners. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And apologies to everyone as we've gone along here. We haven't done much of an introduction or letting people clap and so on, but we're trying to keep on time and hopefully have a good discussion at the end. Can you see my slide there?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to be quick and basically what I want to talk about is some of the stuff that Mark and Maura talked about a little bit, but my role in the Dataverse through GDCC sometimes is basically looking at things where people are active and they're trying to use existing functionality in Dataverse and either making it work or having a tough time and asking the question, could we do this? If we change Dataverse, would it make those easier and would it allow additional things to happen? So in essence, what I wanted to talk about here is sort of a lead into to the discussion is, we mentioned up front, Kevin mentioned the idea of previewers for geospatial data. And I just want to start kind of with a reminder from that direction that what data previewers are in Dataverse. We've popped up over the last year or two. Great. We heard a siren earlier today. Now you get to hear the ice cream truck going through my neighborhood. So the previewers are basically, we have file data in Dataverse, and they're actually separate programs that we're using the external tool APIs to pass the, what file are you looking at, and giving you the user's credentials so that if you're, logged in and looking at draft data, you can still get access. And the previewer is essentially a little app. Most of them right now are HTML and JavaScript that turn that into something useful. So they display an image, or they put up a video viewer and point the video file into it so that you can click and play the video on the screen, those sorts of things. You can see a table and whatnot. And, and you see images, audio, video. Essentially, we're using widgets that exist on the web somewhere and just using a little bit of JavaScript to kind of link, here's the data file from Dataverse, or here's some metadata from the API. Go ahead and do your widget thing and show it in the Dataverse page in most cases now. So the question sort of naturally comes up of, can we do this for geospatial data? And again, you've heard a lot of reasons already as to why geospatial data is different, but the kinds of things I think, we're talking about it for a previewer would be stuff. These are actually screenshots from a previous project where I was on, where I was a co-PI on that was much more heavily into geospatial and hydrology data. So we actually got this far in that one. But, the idea is, looking at for a single file, sort of the equivalent of a file page in Dataverse, being able to see the data overlaid on a map. And I think this is like sediment thicknesses in the state of Illinois. Or if you have a data set, that may have several different ones. This is the Angelo Forest out in California, I believe. But they've got individual files, and they're mostly shape files here that, where the roads and the boundaries of the park and the watersheds and so on you know, and being able to overlay all of them and potentially do some fun little things of turning layers on or off or changing their opacity so you can see through them, but sort of both file and data set level potentially. And so the basically, you know, last slide here already is just asking the question of, sorry, I have a couple slides here, but basically, you know, what's missing? Why can't we just do this out of the box? And essentially what you're probably picking up from the earlier talks already is that the widgets that are out there don't really say, oh, you've got a file, or you've got one of those however many 50 plus formats. We'll just take that in directly and use it. They really are things that work off of, you know, some metadata or a web map service interface or web feature service or a set of tiles so that you can zoom onto it and only pull the parts of the data set you want. And essentially, these are things that require pre-processing of the data set. And so again, a lot of the search things, because Dataverse doesn't do this at all, right? They're getting pulled into some external tool, either Hgl to do conversion or GeoServer to serve these things. And essentially, you know, if we're going to do previews, we're going to need that as well. So sort of the last, getting close to the last slide here. So how do we support this and support the kinds of geo search services that are already being talked about? You know, the questions for me are really, you know, the sort of ways we can do this is sort of two things, right? If we want to have previewers back, we can let the data search services do what they're doing and hopefully, you know, make a GeoServer themselves so that we can just get the metadata back about where are these endpoints and then go use them in Dataverse. Or we can flip it around and make Dataverse the thing that tries to run such a service and hands out the metadata so that you can get directly the metadata and these API endpoints from Dataverse. And one of the options for doing that you know, is a nice abstraction in Dataverse is this idea of a store, where if you're familiar with Dataverse, we mostly talk about file and S3 stores, but essentially what a store does is provide create, read, update, delete access to a data file, and the same thing for any auxiliary files related to that, so thumbnails, ingested formats and whatnot. And sort of make the rest of Dataverse not care whether it's on file or S3 or something else. So I think I'll skip for interest of time here for the moment, this idea of an overlay store, but the question is sort of with a, you know, could we think of a geo store that either, you know, directly when we get these kinds of geo files in, sends them directly off and doesn't store the original file, but sends them off to a server, or potentially something that splits that file and makes a copy over in this other, you know, sends a copy over to GeoServer so that it gets sliced and diced, and or to you know, to other service for images and so on. And the idea of the overlay store here, which I guess I will go back to without saying too much about, is that this is one that sort of breaks out, without saying everything about it, it essentially breaks out where the main file is, which would in this case go off to a trusted remote store, and where the auxiliary files would be, which could be back in S3 or files that Dataverse is managing locally. So you could imagine something where we store the main file in one place and we make a copy or auxiliary files that go someplace else as part of a GeoServer store. So really, you know, my part in this is I've done some of the geospatial stuff before on earlier projects when we started talking with the Harvard Library and hearing about all the geospatial interest, and we started up the interest group in Dataverse. You know, my question started being, well, you know, that there was a lot of discussion early on of, you know, the ways that Dataverse can notify you when a file exists. Right now, all we have is sort of, you can trigger a workflow off of publication, or you can harvest, right, and query. But when somebody uploads a file, if we wanted to preview immediately, or we wanted to see that in search immediately, we don't have those kinds of triggers. So we started asking sort of from the top down here, you know, can we coordinate, and can we make a more robust interface to get metadata back? Could we expand this publication workflow? You know, could we use it internally to have an independent GeoServer getting triggered? Do we need new event mechanisms to kind of dig farther? And again, when files are uploaded and those sorts of things, do we want to start the pre-processing at that point, whether it's us or somebody else doing it, outside of Dataverse, or should we really push it all the way down into a store and essentially have either a geo server, et cetera, perhaps with Hgl in the mix and so on. The sorts of things you've already heard about. Should we plug that directly in and either make that the primary store or a copy store for all of this? And so that's mostly what I wanted to leave the start of the comments and discussion off of is again sort of questions from everybody else, but also thinking about this kind of level of what would be a nice architecture that if we could make some changes to Dataverse, how could we make both what everybody else is trying to do with search and with these things with the previewer kind of idea work better. The last little thing I'll say on the bottom of this here is that one of the things that we really struggled with when we tried to do GeoServer early on in the other project I mentioned is that because it's sort of a full-fledged app server itself, it wants to do its own access control and everything. And so we had a hard time trying to make sure that when we switched permissions of who could access files in our main software, how could we make GeoServer sort of replicate that? And in Dataverse, we've got a lot of things that are starting to work with pre-signed URLs that I won't sort of re-go through the technology here, but it seems like we might be able to do something here, like leaving the GeoServer, as far as it's concerned, fairly open, and then using pre-signed URLs as a way with a proxy in front of it to make sure that unless you have a pre-signed URL from Dataverse, you just don't get in, and GeoServer sort of gets out of the access control game. So I don't know how important that is given the current state of GeoServer and other things, but that may be another piece of technology we can throw in a mix to make our lives easier than the last time I went through this. All right, so with that, I'm 10 seconds over. I didn't do too bad. I think at this point, we'll open it up to questions. I'll spend a couple seconds here turning off my screen share and trying to get back to where I can see the chat. But if anybody's got a question to start with, go ahead and jump in.
So we did capture a question or two in the notes document. A question from Slava. I don't know if you're still on the call, but Slava asked a question for Kevin. How about support for historical boundaries for the Netherlands? It's a big issue as the country is building its own land.
Yeah, so I mean, historical boundaries, of course, will change as time goes on. While at Scholars Portal, I mean, we had to keep separate layers of all the census tracts and stuff as the different years went on. And I feel like, the simple answer to a question like that would be like, well, if the data layer is referencing the time in which the data was recorded and it captures the boundary box from that, it kind of makes it, I guess, a bit of a non-issue. It, of course, does become difficult if you're referencing these sort of census tract layers, and you need to make sure like the data matches the year of the census tract, and that is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing to sort of stay out of the business of geospatial research. And what Kevin just said is sort of our one out here from a lot of things that Wim was talking about earlier, right? A lot of that complexity we hope that other software has to deal with, and we don't have to get into all the details. Wim, I saw you had a hand up as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I've got some fairly strong opinions about this, to be honest. I've started documenting them in the notes, but I think our main focus initially must be on discovery. That could be achieved very simply, I think, by mapping the spatial and temporal coverages and some of the topic or subject keyword lists in geospatial metadata to Dataverse, together with citation information and so on. And by adding the original metadata, whether it's ISO 19115 or other flavors, as a text blob so that it remains available to the end user and can potentially be indexed for informal text searches, which will find many of the things that people are looking for. And from my perspective, it is very complex to include geospatial data with a broad brush into something like Dataverse. The data sets are enormous in many cases. They require specialized equipment and servers that you won't find in a typical Dataverse platform, and hardware. They require experts to optimize the way in which the data sets are stored. Just as an example, if you have two data sets uploaded that both use census tracts as the feature of interest, then most database administrators will store the features only once, have more than one table for each of the variables, and construct materialized views, for instance, in Postgres, because the feature data takes up all the space. So there's no sense in duplicating it. And if you're getting two data sets from two different depositors, I don't think the Dataverse curators are going to do that kind of optimization. So I think both the data services and the visualization should be arm's length on the basis of well-defined APIs, standardized services, and Dataverse is essentially the middleware piping the API response from a data server to appropriate visualization and analysis and exploration tools. We can always revisit it, of course, later, but I think for a first release that will serve 80% of the needs with very little work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a lot of things that are worth commenting on in there. I think one of the things is, again, one of the challenges with Dataverse is that we have data set level metadata, which is manually entered with the bounding box and so on. And then we have the information within files, which, we hope syncs up, but may or may not. So just doing something with the bounding boxes to kind of show where people have said their things are, I think is a pretty easy, sounds like a nice, yep. The file level stuff, I also tend to agree, but at some level, one thing that Dataverse does right now, right, as a repository and as something that's archiving the data, it's getting copies of that stuff anyway, and it's not deduplicating. So in that sense, Geospatial isn't unique. It would be nice to deduplicate regardless, and maybe that would be something that should be done overall.
Yeah, but it's also complex because we're not only talking about operational copies of the data where these, let's say, dedicated server environments are best suited, but we're also, from a reproducibility and long-term preservation point of view, talking about a completely different thing, because there you don't need these operational servers and subsetting and APIs for serving the data in different formats and so on. You could just dump the data in a long-term preservation format, which is probably JSON or CSV, and just leave it there. So.
Right. The last thing I'll just point out in there is, again, I think some of the things that's getting done with the trusted remote stores might be a way to think about this, to sort of be more hands-linked, right, the ODM TRSA concept is the data is so sensitive or so large that you're actually never going to send it to Dataverse, and you're going to go access it through an enclave somewhere at their site. In some sense, we might be able to think about Geospatial the same way, right? It's too hard to handle. You just never want to send it. You just want to tell Dataverse that yeah, it's in here, but it's managed by something else. So
that's right, and it has implications, as I said, for certification and where the curation workflow starts and ends and the responsibilities, but that's a non-technical issue, basically.
Yep, thanks. Other questions live, or we'll go dig back through? Danny, did you have other ones from the chat?
Oh yeah, there's a question from Ben Lewis in the chat. Ben, did you want to ask your question?
Sorry, it's a legacy of the past.
Sure. Well, it's just a very basic question. I came in late, I'm sorry. But yeah, it was just a general question. Having thought about this a bit over the years, and know that there are many ways of skinning this cat, I'm just wondering whether there is anything out there in the Dataverse community, an attempt to define the requirements for such a thing. And by such a thing, I guess I'm just leaving it very general as, you know, making geodata relevant for Dataverse and vice versa, right? So that could be discovery is obviously an important part of that. Maybe some form of visualization, you know. Can we say clearly whether this is something that where we need to be serving up data or metadata, whether we need to build some core new stuff into Dataverse, or, you know, are we thinking about the important functionality as something that, you know, takes place outside of Dataverse, you know, via map services or, you know, harvesting of metadata. It's just a very general question. I don't know whether, and it's fine if not, if it's all wide open, that's great. But it is a very broad topic.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and again, part of I'll make a plug for our, you know, metadata working groups and the geospatial interest group that we have out there in Slackland and can have meetings for. So I think the intent isn't necessarily that we have to finish all the answers here in the next 15 minutes, but so these are certainly things that we can continue talking about. To more pointedly try and answer your question, I think, you know, my sense of Dataverse is, right, it's been a data publishing and long-term availability kind of mechanism, and what people want to add in is more, you know, discovery services that go beyond what Dataverse provides, especially in geospatial. And then with the previewers, you know, the other previewers have basically you know, found interest because people want to know what they're getting before they go click the download button and that sort of thing. And so I think a geospatial preview, and really beyond that, even with the previewers, right, they're external tools, and so we've tried not to embed them, you know, in the internals. And then anything beyond that, I think we've really been talking about, you know, trigger workflow, connect to an external tool, use the API, don't put compute, don't put a lot of calculation or, you know, manipulation inside Dataverse. Try and get as much of that outside as we can. So. And again, you know, somewhat provocatively, I guess if I make it the internal store and stuff in GeoServer, I'm breaking that a little bit, right? So that's a, you know, good argument that that's either too far, or we really want to make that kind of store something that, you know, is A, it's optional, and B, you know, the copy idea might be the right way to go, so that it's trying to send stuff off from the store level, but it's not relying on that, so that if that goes away, it doesn't break anything in Dataverse, that sort of thing.
I do love the Dataverse, the GeoServer community, and I've worked with them quite a bit over the years. GeoServer is a very big Swiss Army knife. It's very powerful, but I do worry about bringing something like that under the hood of something like Dataverse. And just a thought along those lines, I think, as we probably all know, you know, data, geospatial data can be served pretty scalably and elegantly by simply converting a data set, simply in quotes, converting a data set to, say, tiles or vector tiles. Now, I could imagine maybe it would need a lot of thought, careful thought, you know, but you could imagine, since Dataverse already takes in you know, it consumes a data set and then I think represents it, does some magic on it to store it properly and version it and everything. And maybe it could make sense to, if it determines that it's of the right type of spatial data, it could store it as a tile or a vector tile set. And the nice thing is that when it does that, it produces a way to visualize it very efficiently, both for itself, if it wants to represent the layer on the Dataverse page, but it also provides a nice service for anybody outside to visualize it. And it doesn't take up much in the way of server resources. Now, tiling a big data set, of course, can take a lot of work.
Right.
If you do it intelligent, if you do it sort of just on the fly, just as needed, maybe that could make sense. I don't know. I also like the idea of just some minimal detectors to try to assign bounding boxes or spatial features, sort of a georeferencing or geo-mining little process that could assign spatial elements to the metadata, say, to support spatial search. Those are sort of two thoughts, which are not new things, I realize.
Yeah, so maybe I can call on Paul and ask a little bit about the Geo Name System that you've implemented, because it does seem like this is the covering 80% of the cases. Question is like, yeah, how the heck do we get a boundary box out of data that someone hasn't put it in? And I will say, like, finding out the boundary box is not the most like trivial things at times, especially when other tools are required. So yeah, Paul, could you speak a little bit about that? Because I looked into geonames, and the best I could get from like the all the all countries file was like a lat and long, but you're getting a boundary box from that. Could you say a bit more about this?
Yeah, so there are like a couple different things with geonames. Like, so the country file will give you a geonames ID, but then you can look up the geonames ID and get a lot more information about that record. What we found is, because geonames does do, like, the more information you put into it, sort of the better it's going to be in terms of searching for stuff, which makes sense. But we've been recently looking into there's a score associated with each like search result, in hopes that we'd be able to use that, be like, okay, if it reaches a certain threshold, then we're confident that that is what we're looking for. I am not sure how they're generating their scores. Like, I did a search for United States of America, and that got a lower score than United States, which seemed weird to me, but
did it exceed the threshold?
Well, then the other thing was that, like, the only places online people were talking about a score between 0 and 100, but I was getting, for some things, scores between 0 and 100, and other things I was getting scores of like 350. And so I'm not sure how to interpret a score of 350 if in theory it's a score between 0 and 100. So as of right now, that score is not helpful to me unless someone has more information that I have not found yet about what those scores represent. As a result, for us, we are using the F codes for countries, state/province, and city, and providing as much information as we can for each one, and hoping that the first answer that comes up is the right one. And it seems like that generally is the case. Because yeah, like we didn't want the whole Springfield, USA issue coming up. It's like, oh, Springfield, USA. Sure.
Which one?
Which one? Which is why we started doing things like requiring, if you have a city, that you have to have a state and a country, to try to eliminate those issues.
Yeah. If you saw the flexible metadata session earlier today, one of the things that I think might allow here is rather than having the straight geo fields that we have now to have a JavaScript take over that and actually query geonames directly. So we could have the user typing in Springfield and selecting which one they meant, and then that will populate the stuff we want in Dataverse correctly. So hopefully we can try and catch that at the front end as well.
I mean, that'd be great. Also, then that would eliminate a lot of like random spelling errors that pollute the metadata.
Yep. Jiwon, did you?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Jim. So basically, I have a question for Paul. So I'm wondering, like, how often do you have this data from Dataverse? And for example, because the data are continuously being added to Dataverse, right? And if we want to make them accessible through geodesy, so you need to harvest them periodically, or how often do you update to harvest data? And also, how can you identify which data set are new added and which are not? How do you?
So for the first question, with our sort of more generic Dataverse coupled one, basically it was reharvesting from Dataverse every night, finding records that had been harvested already or records that had been harvested but had been changed somehow. With our new system, it's a bit longer between checks, like because there are like 70 something repositories and 120,000 records or something like that, or 150, I don't remember what the exact number is. All of the records sort of get refreshed over a period of 30 days. So it can be a bit longer before new records get into Geodesy now. But we just have a lot more records in there now. What was your second question, or does that answer the first question?
Yes. So my second question is, how do you identify which data set are new added? So according to what you just answered, it seems you go through all the Dataverse to harvest all this metadata, right? So you didn't identify which are new added and which are not.
So we have a list of all of the persistent IDs that we have harvested. And we also have a list of what versions of the data sets we have. So if the version changes, then we know that there's been some sort of adjustment to that record. And if we don't have that PID in our system, that means we haven't harvested it yet.
I have one last question, sorry. So according to your presentation, it seems you, you displayed the 3 different parts basically for the whole project. So my question is, how many copies of data do you have? It seems you have one copy of data set in Dataverse, and you have one copy in middleware, and you have another copy in GeoServer. So basically there are 3 copies of data sets, is that true?
There are at most 2. There is the original copy in wherever the repository is where it's being stored. And then if it's a geospatial file, we have another copy that is stored in the middleware going into GeoServer.
Okay, so the middleware is the place to store the data instead of GeoServer.
Well, the GeoServer is in the middleware.
Oh, the GeoServer.
The middleware VM has the GeoServer that the front end will ping to get a data set preview.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think we are at the end of our official time. We'll go a minute or 2 into the break here just to wrap up. I don't have anything specific to say other than, thanking Kevin for stepping up to be a co-chair here, and thanking all the speakers once again. And again, I'll encourage everyone to, if you're interested in the topic and or working in it, please join the Slack channel, get involved with the interest group, and hopefully, again, my part of this is trying to make all of the things we want to do easier by sort of tweaking the internals of Dataverse the right way. So I'm glad to have all the feedback here today. That's been very useful, and hope to get some more as we go forward. Kevin, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, thank you for all that you do in trying to make this easier, because it does seem like it's a lot of trying to make the most of what we have with minimal sort of adjustment to Dataverse. And if there's the potential for some maybe minimal adjustments or further adjustments to be made to Dataverse to make everyone else's lives easier. And then of course, like make it that much easier to find geospatial data. I mean, gosh, that would be so wonderful. So thank you. And thank you to everyone else as well.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Well, Danny left and gave me host power. So with that, I'll go ahead and click the exit button and end everything for us all, and hope to see you in the next session and so on.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,